Hi, everybody. Today I'm going to be talking about the AQA Comedy Anthology and giving you some updated notes. It's been a few years now since I uploaded my first videos on poetry, and I've taught these poems every year since, and you learn different things about the poems the longer you spend teaching them. So this is for A level, and this is for the Aspects of Comedy course, 7 different poems from 7 different poets, all of which are designed to give students a snapshot of different aspects, really, of the comedy genre. So very simply, I'm going to go through each of the 7 poems, just updating some annotations which may not have featured in the first set of videos. So with John Donne's The Flea, we're dealing here with, of course, a metaphysical poem with the metaphysical conceit where the flea has the capacity to suck blood, and the speaker, in his intellectual way, is using that as a device to try and persuade this woman, his mistress, to have premarital sex. Settings are important in literature, and we've got to remember that the speaker is persuading the mistress for sex in a very private space where he is not going to get interrupted. And he can also reject any religious or moral impropriety as well. So essentially, what he's saying is, this is just between you and me. Let's forget about the outside world. Let's just do what we want, and let's not worry about things that would maybe criticize us. So he occupies a private space with this mistress. In the poem, the word marriage is repeated. There is reference to marriage bed and marriage temple. And of course, this alludes to, in comedy, how marriage is often a focus of comedy, as well as the pursuit of that love or that marriage, because it represents togetherness or that sense of happiness. So the marriage and the flea, therefore, is a metaphorical representation of their togetherness. The flea in itself is an absurd symbol. It's not a symbol that we often think about when we're talking about love or even sexual desire. The flea itself is small and trivial because the speaker is trying to say my request is also small and trivial. But it's also has got the capacity to suck blood, and therefore the blood is mingled in the flea, and therefore the idea is that the blood represents their togetherness. So he's using it on a metaphorical level. The speaker, some adjectives to describe him. The speaker is resourceful, persuasive, and opportunistic. He is wooing the mistress with skill in a very theatrical and elaborate way in the hope of impressing her. So he hopes maybe that she's going to be impressed with his use of the flea. The problem is that might not be the case, and the mistress perhaps enjoys testing him by killing the flea after specifically saying that she shouldn't, she does anyway. So I don't think that she's like a trembling victim. She's enjoying testing him. And you could also view the flea as flirtatious, and it proves, of course, that comedy is often about something, often about things which are to do with lewdness or bawdiness as well. So some just updated notes there about the flea. Satirical Elegy by Jonathan Swift tends not to be a popular choice for most students, actually. They don't really enjoy the prospect of talking about this poem. Maybe it's because it's very little happens in it, maybe. But just some updated notes with Satirical Elegy. The Duke, John Churchill, is representative of the incompetent ruling class who represent a system of preferment, vanity, and greed rather than a meritocracy. So he is accused, or Swift accuses him, of deliberately prolonging the War of Spanish Succession to enrich himself and his party. Both Swift and the Duke are political opponents in terms of Tories and Whigs. In the poem, you have that phrase, turn to dirt from whence he sprung. And of course, the connotations of dirt is something that is valueless. And therefore, despite the Duke's medals and his honours that he might have been given by people in his day, now that he's died, he has returned to nothingness. He is valueless. And that is really part of this satirical kind of Juvenalian satire, really kind of entering into a diatribe about this figure. A diatribe is another word for a rant, really. So Swift is using a Juvenalian satire here, where the speaker is embarking on a bitter and vitriolic diatribe about a figure who is representative of corrupt power. So this poem reminds us that comedy has always been concerned to some extent with attacking the elite. Nowadays, we might say celebrity. And we have publications like Private Eye, whose role really is to poke fun and criticise figures that are representative of the elite. And really, Private Eye, as well as this poem, is taking much spirit and taking much enjoyment from ridiculing and humiliating these people who perhaps think that they are untouchable because of their honours. And what satire does is it reminds us that that's not always the case. Tam O'Shanter. So in terms of settings, the poem is representative of Scotland, not only because it's set in the market town of Ayr, but also because of the Scottish dialect and a notable idiolect. So what I always say to students is just to see past the dialect and to actually concentrate on the story, because once you understand the story, it's relatively easy to find references to that particular part of the narrative. Tam is a representative of a lovable rogue character, maybe also an archetypal fool character, who represents the uncultivated behaviour of the lower social classes. And it's a reminder that comedy does always tend to be about ordinary people rather than those with status. So in comedy, we're not always talking about kings and queens like tragedy. We're talking about ordinary people that you would find in any street. In the poem, we have a party, and parties are often focused on in comedy because it creates a revelrous, carousing, mirthful, and an atmosphere full of merriment. And those words are all to do with the effects of comedy in terms of the mood. The party, though, in the church, Kirk Alloway, is also surreal and bizarre. And it serves as the climax of the poem because it's here, of course, where Tam forgets himself in his drunken state and shouts out "Well done, Cutty Sark," which makes the witch chase him to the bridge. So what Burns does in this poem is at this time there would have been lots of folklore to do with witches. They would have believed that witches existed and had sinister capabilities like kind of rotting a harvest or spoiling a harvest or sinking a ship at sea. But here what Burns has done is he's decided to turn those witches into figures of fun, and also to, I suppose, reinforce or foreground Tam's foolishness and buffoonery in this poem. So those there, some updated notes that maybe were not in the original videos that I did. Sonny Prestatyn has got a few things that I want to update with based on discussions and things that I have read in the years since I uploaded those initial videos. So Sonny Prestatyn by Larkin proves that comedy can often originate from what is controversial or dark. Sometimes comedy is awkward, and sometimes the awkwardness and the catharsis makes us laugh. Sometimes comedy can be about dark undercurrents or controversial issues, and comedians do get themselves into trouble sometimes by their jokes maybe being a bit too close to the wire. So Larkin's colloquial and vivid descriptions of the poster's vandalism may be humorous, because what Larkin is doing is these people, and it's implied that they're men, who have defaced and vandalised this poster are flawed. And that's why the poem says she was too good for this life, describing the girl in the poster, because humans are far too flawed to leave beauty alone. So in this poem, you have that very vivid juxtaposition between the facades and utopian world of advertising and marketing, which always tend to be too perfect for our actual real lives and bear little resemblance to our everyday existence. So there is this juxtaposition in this poem between the false beauty and utopia of the poster in the first stanza and the dystopian and crude description of people in the second and third stanza. In other words, people are far too flawed to allow this utopian world set up in this poster to exist for too long. And the kind of the experiment that I always say to students that we should do is to leave a poster in a communal corridor, leave it for 2 weeks and see if anything happens to that poster, suggesting that, again, humanity is still flawed and still has shortcomings. So yes, it is the comic descriptions of this vandalism that can be humorous, but it's also the social commentary that Larkin is giving, which is that people are far too flawed to leave beauty alone. Not my best side. Just to recap the fact that the structure of the poem with these three monologues enables the characters to have an equal say. So we hear their distinct voices in equal amounts. And it's through those voices, of course, that we understand that the language is too modern. The language is far too colloquial for the time period at which this painting was done. We understand that characters are vain and egotistical. The fact that we have a dragon that's speaking anyway is quite absurd. We can't forget that. A nice creative writing task might be for you to write a poem about an existing work of art. So to write a comic poem about the Mona Lisa, or the figure in the Scream, for example, that is screaming in that painting. So that's essentially what Fanthorpe is doing. And by doing that, you're writing an ekphrastic poem. You're writing a poem about an existing work of art. And that your poem might be very different to the expectation that we have of the Mona Lisa, for example. You might get her to speak a bit like a chav, for example, or to speak in a very kind of colloquial way, which you would not expect. You would be doing exactly the same as Fanthorpe. The painting represents high culture and high art. Here, Fanthorpe is inverting that and also inverting the expected narrative of the poem and the characters and the roles they're supposed to have. So it's that disparity between what we think the characters should be like and what they're actually like. And in so doing, Fanthorpe is satirising the cultural stereotypes of the 1970s, as well as mocking high art and the painting. She's making the painting far more colloquial than we expect, far more ordinary in their language than we expect from these austere painted figures. Again, reminding us that comedy is about common people and kind of common styles of language. My Ravel's house, we need to remember that the mother-in-law is a stock comic villain. Mother-in-laws have often been the focus of comedy, but they're usually the focus of comedy from the perspective of men, not from women. So here, Lockheed changes the perspective and actually gets a female speaker to enter into this very kind of passive bitterness about this mother-in-law, who is the stock comic villain of the mother-in-law. The poem shows how the mask of manners can act as a restrictive force that stops people from being open and honest about how they really feel. So the comedy comes from the fact that the daughter is having to suppress her real feelings and actually put up a front to do with the mask of manners. The house is crucial to the creation of comedy in this poem because that is where these characters are. They have to occupy the same time and place in order for these feelings to be heard. And you could argue that the speaker is kind of catastrophizing a bit, maybe. She's maybe speaking too hyperbolically, and it's not as bad as she might think it is. But in her own mind, of course, she is catastrophizing and really worrying about the judgment that the mother-in-law is making, but also is well aware that she's a stranger in this house and is having to live by somebody else's rules because the house is the mother-in-law's domain where she has control and power. So the desire for the speaker to make a good impression actually becomes quite restrictive. And that's seen, for example, when she has a cup of tea. Rather than asking for the tea to be made properly to her taste, she has to drink every bitter cup, suggesting that she feels very restricted here in this house and is uncomfortable. And that might be relatable to readers. But again, this is about an ordinary set of people. This is not about people that we cannot relate to. This could be about me or you if we're meeting our in-laws for the first time. So comedy always also tends to have that relatability. Finally, Mrs. Sisyphus. What can we add to this poem? The fact that Duffy has taken an old myth, which again has associations with high culture, and comically inverts that to modernise it and linking it to a modern idea of being a workaholic and the effect marrying a workaholic can have on the standard of their marriage and their relationship. Again, any of us could be in a relationship with a workaholic. The question is, what do we react to that like? Do we feel rejected and bitter, or do we let them get away with it? So it's that idea of work versus me. The Mrs. Sisyphus here, of course, feels very ostracized from her husband, and she's left with her twisted smirk. The poem is eponymous, which means that the main character is also the title of the poem. And it means that the female speaker is put in a position of empowerment who is uninterrupted. So the poem could be seen as a monologue, or even a stream of consciousness, or a diatribe, or a rant about her husband, who seems to lack the kind of insight to see the futility of what he is doing. There's no end to it. And perhaps also having the arrogance to think that he is the best man for the job. So marriage, as we've already said, is a common focus of comedies, but they can either be comedy can either come from the pursuit of them or the dysfunctionality of them. And this, of course, links more to the latter, the dysfunctional relationship, because of Mr. Sisyphus's flaw and arrogance, maybe, in failing to see how his wife is being neglected. In terms of the wording of the poem, work is the central reason for the conflict felt. And if you go through the poem, you can actually see the poem is full of words that either rhyme or half rhyme with work. Kirk, Burke, jerk, dork, mark, shark, hawk. They've all got that plosive K sound, cuss sound, which you might say sounds quite harsh, which represents the speaker's frustration and resentment at how she is being neglected by her husband, who consistently puts his work before her, and she's fed up with it, as you can tell by saying things like he speaks a lot of old bollocks, he's a Burke, he's a dork, all of these kind of words. So that's some updating there with some of the annotations for Mrs. Sisyphus by Duffy. So hopefully that was useful. I've gone through there each of the 7 poems that make up the comedic anthology. Open book, of course, for AS, or closed book for A2. For A2 being used in conjunction with another text, another comedy text that you have studied. But hopefully, because it has been several years since I initially uploaded my first set of videos about these poems, new things come to light, and you can use this video to update your previous annotations about these poems based on what myself and my students have been discussing over the last few years. Okay, so hopefully that was useful in terms of updating your notes and knowledge of the poems in the A-level comedy anthology with AQA. Thanks for watching and good luck.